Hello, Kindred. I had my roots redone this morning, and then I had to rush to an audition, so while I don't really mind how the bright blonde roots look with the teal, on camera, it kind of looks like I'm balding. I popped on my spring Arya wig. Arya is one of my LARP characters. Yes, I LARP. You're so surprised, I know. So, we're gonna be going through some rough topics today. Consider this a content warning. We are going to be talking about Persephone's assault, the aftermath, and steps to recovery. Those steps that we hope we will get to see with this lovely character in her healing process. With that in mind, while I will try to put a bit of levity in your heart if and when I can, it's not exactly a subject that really lends itself to that, but please tread carefully and keep your own mental health in mind first and foremost. If you need to take a break, that's okay. Just pause the video and come back when you're ready. Knowledge, above all else, should be empowering, and sometimes with information like this, it can send a shock to our system if we're not ready for it, which is really the opposite of empowerment. So, my name is Kiri Callaghan, and you might want to grab some tea for this. Apollo, in the short time I've known you, all you've done is take from me my peace, my joy, my dignity. One day, I hope I can make you feel as afraid of me as I am of you right now. And it is you who can be the one trembling for words behind a windshield. This time, I took something from you. Because this is war. So, before we cut a slice of this very serious pie, can we talk about how apparently Persephone has prehensile hair? Like an anime villain or Entrapta from She-Ra? I have so many feelings and all of them are amazing. Her inner monologue also gives me a lot of feelings. Mostly hope. But while taking down Apollo is important, and people should know he's a scumbag, and this is definitely not the first time he's assaulted a woman, and you can sure as heck bet it won't be the last if something isn't done. But where I am slightly wary is too often, especially when our trauma is very fresh, we mistake the idea of retribution for healing. And the two are very rarely related. We know Persephone has a darker side, and we've seen flashes of it with her anger. Something terrible has clearly happened in her past that caused a lot of questionable soul counterfeiting a la Hermes. We've seen her actively choose to not let venom sink into her, and while I absolutely would love to see Apollo beaten with a rod, or more appropriately locked up and humiliated, I hope it doesn't come at the cost of Persephone's empathy. Not her empathy for him, I mean in general. One of the hardest things I have personally found in this world is being empathetic, but keeping yourself safe from manipulators, energy vampires, and abusers. It's hard to be guarded without becoming jaded. First, I do want to talk about Apollo. Well, rather not him specifically, but the psychology behind sexual assault. There is a misconception that rape, molestation, or even harassment comes from the desire for sex, when in reality it has very little to do with sex at all. Sex is sort of just the tool that's used, but it's not the motivation. For instance, if someone was murdered with a hammer, the hammer was a tool used, but it's not the motivation. Motives vary from murder to murder, and very rarely the motive is, I just like to kill people with hammers. I'm not saying it's not ever that, it's just very rarely. Whereas when it comes to sexual assault, ultimately it's always motivated by the assaulter's sense of self, whether it's a need for validation, power, dominance, or control. Statistics show us that most sexual violence is perpetrated by cisgendered men. That is not to say that cisgendered men cannot also be victims. Typically in these scenarios, there's almost always asymmetrical power dynamics where the assaulter occupies a more powerful and dominant position in relation to the victim. Even in some cases, the assaulter, now in a place of power, is lashing out at a victim who they perceived might have had more power than them at another point in time. Some assaulters will lash out at victims who rejected them sexually in the past and therefore damaged their own view of themselves, of what they deserve, can or cannot have, violating that sort of internal entitlement. Another example of what drives sexual harassment and assault is, why do men catcall women? Countless studies have shown us it's not because they think it will actually bring them sexual gratification. I've been catcalled from a car speeding past me, and even if I had been like, oh my gosh, yes, take me, I've been waiting for this moment, he was like 3 blocks down already, because it's not actually about sexual gratification. It's about asserting dominance or validating self-worth through outside means. In this particular case, likely because that person wasn't feeling in control of one aspect of their life, they took it out on the first woman they saw because that gentleman, just by being a man, has more social power than I do. As flattering as that thought is, it's similar to the cycle of abuse. Bullies are bullied, they bully other people. I will step on you because someone stepped on me and it makes me feel better temporarily to step on you. It's that same mindset. No good can ever come from basing your entire self-worth on an outside source of approval or validation. While it may not necessarily result in this, inevitably, you come to resent those outside sources if you're not getting what you feel you need, and will potentially take it out on either yourself or those sources, and neither option is good. In Lore Olympus, Apollo is a very prominent Olympian who is, as Zeus described, popular with the mortals, and has probably never been told no a day in his life other than by his twin sister, whom it's kind of clear he doesn't really respect and just manipulates like every other person. And Persephone, again as Zeus described, is a B-grade goddess of spring who, again, has only been in literal existence for 19 years. Yes, they're immortal. They're all going to live forever, essentially. They're gonna live forever! Sorry, I needed that moment. Very heavy topics. They are all going to live forever, but I hope I don't have to remind you that at 19, your brain hasn't fully stopped forming. I'm serious. It literally takes until you are 27 for your brain to fully mature. So the power dynamic between Persephone and Apollo is massively skewed. Not only is Apollo a prominent Olympian, but he is a prominent male Olympian in a society that's run by, well, this jerk. Similarly, in our world, we know of countless stories where that power dynamic has occurred with family, strangers, classmates, and friends, where men asserted a power that was bestowed on them simply because they were men. I'm sure someone will watch this and label me a man-hating lesbian for simply referencing facts, so let me state this. Yes, there are cases where women are also the perpetrator, and more often than not, they hold a place of power over their victim. You know what? Let's actually look into some of those facts right now, because they are devastating and important. The latest statistics from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center state 1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men will be raped at some point in their lifetimes. 91% of victims of rape and sexual assault are female and 9% are male. That is not really taking into account non-binary and any other gender, but as they were identified upon their birth, you understand. In 8 out of 10 of these cases, victims knew their assaulter. While sexual assault costs the US more than any other crime, it is still the most underreported. 63% of victims never tell the police. And the prevalence of false reporting, before anyone says there's a lot of myths around that, is only from 2 to 10%, and that has varied depending on the year and the location. And these statistics aren't even breaking down different genders or cis versus trans, like the fact that trans women are more likely to be assaulted, as are women of color. As for offenders themselves, that data is a little harder to find in regards to specifics. But a 2019 study in the Journal of Clinical Medicine gathered thousands of samples from various victim reports in the USA, UK, Ireland, and Germany, which gave a range of 1.5 to 20% of female child sex offenders, depending on the country. Another study published in Criminal Justice Behavior did a more overarching study which included 17 samples from 12 different countries, where it found an overall 11.6% of sexual offenders were women. This study also found that female sexual offenders were more common among juvenile offenders rather than adults. So looking at those numbers, we know that anything outside of that 1.5 to 11.6 or 20%, depending which victim demographic you're looking at, we know that those who identify as male take up the not spoken percentage. Comparing those two studies alone, we're able to see that when an offender is female, whether that offender is juvenile or an adult themselves, their victim is more likely to be juvenile. Which brings us back to power dynamics. Apollo isn't just a prominent Olympian. He's someone who believes he is owed a yes to whatever he wants. As we talked about before, Apollo exhibits clear narcissistic personality disorder traits. To Apollo, a no or a denial of any kind is a direct insult to his sense of self. The moment he realized he found Persephone attractive, it was imperative for her to feel the same about him. He needs that validation, as most narcissists do, and he will take it every time, because harassment and ignoring boundaries and consent is not about sex. It's about your assaulter's self-worth, validation, and the need to have power that you can just take whatever you want. To make a uncomfortable but real-life comparison, let's think back to when that behind-the-scenes footage from Access Hollywood aired, and we heard Trump brag about assaulting women. When you're a star, they let you do it. Apollo's position is no different. Being denied that is considered an assault upon their ego. If you go back to his first episode and watch Apollo's expressions carefully through when he wasn't the center of attention or is even told politely no when he offers his help, he takes it as a slight against him that cannot stand, because it's a slight to his perception of himself and his power. I know we've briefly touched on it before, and we'll talk more about the tactics manipulators use to control people around them, but Apollo's first appearance is riddled with it. As for that need of validation and power, we first saw him actually get it through that dang photo. All he's told is she's not actively angry at him anymore, and he takes this as he is cleared to grab her without her consent and take this photo. This is still a violation of her boundaries. Even Hera remarks how absolutely terrified she looks. Consent is something we should be practicing every day in so many interactions. In many instances, we may have blanket consent until the other person says otherwise, and that's totally fine. But if you've just met someone and you don't know their boundaries, it's not just polite to ask if you can hug them. It's acknowledging that they also are an autonomous human being who may not wish to be touched. People have different boundaries and comfort levels, and because we aren't robots, those comfort levels are bound to shift depending on the day, our relationship with the person, how we're currently feeling. Millions of factors can go into it. So it's really good to just check in. When we ignore this very simple action of requesting rather than just assuming and taking, we are ignoring that person's completely valid right to say no. I was raised in a very affectionate family, but I also know that physical affection might not be the love language of the person I'm currently talking to. I also know there are days where even I don't want to be touched. But regardless of what those reasons are, I don't owe people an explanation. I should be able to just say, sorry, I don't feel like being touched right now. A simple no is a very valid answer to a request or a question. And the hardest thing I've had to learn is when people get angry at no, or even if when we're afraid they're going to get angry at something they're asking of us. it's because they're not really asking. They're demanding under the guise of a question. If you don't do this already, and it's totally okay that you don't, because it's something that we're learning as a society, if you're a hugger, the next time you meet someone, just ask, "May I hug you?" Or even, "Are you also a hugger?" before you go in for that hug. The number of times I have seen people look pleasantly surprised at being asked is a little heartbreaking, actually. Consent towards platonic affection is just something we've never really practiced as a society, despite that we have different love languages and comfort levels. Another layer of consent that we won't get into, but is also vitally important, is emotional consent. Maybe I should just make a video about the layers of consent at some point. Kiri? Put a pin in that for later. Point being, Apollo violates multiple layers of consent before he sexually assaults her, including that hug, the photo being taken of her, actually, putting his coat on her despite her clear discomfort, how he keeps touching her unnecessarily while dealing with the cut, and even how he takes ownership over her safety by saying he should have been at the party to protect her. She tells him to stop. She physically removes his hands. She has to assert that she is her own person and can take care of herself. Rereading that conversation was actually quite exhausting, because you can feel boundaries being pushed against, despite Persephone trying to put them up. Even before he calls Persephone his girl, vomit, Apollo's actions show us that he sees her as a something, not a someone, that he can do with whatever he pleases. Treating people like objects rather than your peers is also about power. If people are beneath you, you don't have to worry about their wants or needs. They solely exist for your pleasure and service. I need like a flesh-boiling shower after talking about that. Now, why did we slog through all that ickiness? Because in order to understand the full impact sexual violence has on its victims, you need to understand why it happens. And why the many victim-blaming questions, such as, well, what were you wearing? Or what did you say to them? Aren't just putting the full responsibility on the victim. Because what you were wearing does not give someone license to assault you and treat you like you're subhuman. But these questions have a fundamental misunderstanding of why sexual assault happens. I was once assaulted by a stranger while I was wearing 3 layers, snow boots, a big puffy coat, and it was broad daylight. I was admiring the Christmas decorations people had put up, and it had just snowed, which is kind of a big thing in Seattle. So I was on my way to a coffee shop from my apartment, just sort of admiring everything. So please understand the full weight when I say that a man who tried to grope and kiss me on the street had nothing to do with me being sexual. I want to go back to those statistics, those absolutely terrifying numbers. Nobody wants to remember trauma, not the victims it happens to, and we certainly don't want to remember it as a society. It reminds us that the world isn't as safe as we want to believe it is. Now, for a healthy brain, the reality of those statistics really aren't going to sink in. The reason being is even the most pessimistic of us have brains that are wired to be more optimistic, even if we don't realize it. It's a method of survival. Yeah, those are the statistics, but I'll be okay. I mean, that sort of thing happens to other people. We don't have time to go into it right now, but I highly recommend Tali Sharrett's TED Talk on the optimism bias. I've linked it below. Now, a brain dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder takes this survival method to an entirely new level. We repress, and we don't address it. When something is so painful for us, our minds will literally lock that traumatic experience away in a different part of our brain that we might even forget about it until something triggers that memory. We might react as someone who has undergone that damage, but by being more paranoid, closed off, on edge, but our subconscious kind of puts up this wall and goes, yeah, no, don't look too deep into why you're feeling this. Nope, nothing to see here. Sexual violence is the complete disregard for your personhood. And that kind of trauma leaves a mark that you can feel everywhere. The phrase, "it's all in your head," in regards to psychological damage is, well, not just condescending, but fails to acknowledge that our brain is our information center. Everything has to go through it for us to register it. In the same way, a patient who has had a limb amputated can feel it, even though that appendage is no longer there. Those who have experienced sexual trauma can still often feel their assault. For example, that encounter on the street, that happened 11 years ago. The encounter from when he first spoke to me and to when I ran away to find other people was maybe a total of 2 minutes. Probably less. The actual assault part of that encounter, 3 seconds, max. I have since experienced far worse, yet some 347 million seconds later, I can still feel his hand on me every now and then. Sometimes it's because I'm walking outside in the snow, and sometimes it's that particular area of Seattle when I go back to visit. Sometimes it's seemingly out of the blue because something in my background processing that I'm not aware of was decompressing, something that felt similar enough that it cropped up. These are traumatic triggers. For Persephone, it was a camera flash. Just a flash of light, and she was back in that moment. But otherwise, she's been doing what most victims do, trying to find normalcy, trying to carry on. The only thing really with her trauma that she's actively focused on is that she feels guilty she no longer qualifies for her scholarship. But even that she approached as if she had made the choice. The word rape is not even uttered until Eros. Persephone has still not been able to say it aloud herself. This is important, because actually being able to say that word, it took me years to say it. I referred to 2 separate instances as very bad one-night stands until finally I talked to a professional about it, because it was easier to process if I thought about it that way. Because if it was just a bad date, I could get away with just not thinking about it ever again. It was just something simple and stupid that everyone goes through. Once I called it what it was, that gave the situation a reality that our brains don't want to relive. So Persephone hasn't talked about it. And she certainly hasn't talked about it to Artemis. I know a lot of people were disappointed that she didn't just let it out in that moment, and it felt like a letdown with no payoff. But the fact that she wasn't able to say it, the fact she just shut down and clamped up, that's what happens to victims. We saw an anger flare up at the mention of Apollo, because Apollo is again trying to impose himself on Persephone's life. And he's doing this through lies that he's told his sister, who is her friend, the first person who seemed to stand up to her mother for her. And how agonizing would it be to have someone who had been a safe space for you to be completely oblivious that their own brother had attacked you? Artemis put herself on the line for Persephone. And while they still don't know each other that well, Persephone can't bring herself to not only say what Apollo did aloud for her own sake, she's also struggling knowing what it will do to Artemis. Or also not entirely knowing if Artemis will believe her if she does say it. But either way, it will hurt her. And knowing that you have information, while true, could hurt someone who's helped you, it makes you feel ungrateful. But telling anyone what your rapist did is hard. We hear stories and we want to believe victims, but when it's someone we know, there is an internal bias we have to fight against. When I was in a similar situation, I struggled telling people who didn't even know them what had happened. Telling mutual friends was even harder, and I can't even imagine what it would be like to tell someone that their twin, someone who they shared their life and even womb with, assaulted you. I will draw attention, however, to Artemis's expression in this moment. She looks scared, wary. And maybe that's because she's never seen Persephone truly angry. That's completely likely. But given Apollo's mythological background, it's possible this isn't the first time one of Artemis's friends has been taken advantage of. Bear with me, because I'm just theorizing off of expressions and some general suspicion Artemis might have around her brother. I'm not saying she's aware of Apollo assaulting someone else, but is it possible she's had friends in the past who just stopped hanging around and she didn't know why? I mean, that's a bit of tinfoil hat of me, but take it as you will. And even Hermes has a bit of an expression about him when he walks in on Apollo and Persephone when her hand's getting bandaged. And maybe it is, oh no, is my friend hitting on this girl that I really like? Maybe it is. But they both have a wariness that sometimes you see in people when they suspect something, but they're not ready to really look and investigate because it's too painful. Or maybe not. Again, this is completely speculating. Now, right now, Persephone is struggling, and with all stories, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. But let's go over the 3 basic phases of recovery after this kind of trauma. The first phase is safety and stabilization. People affected by trauma tend to feel unsafe in their bodies and in their relationships with others. Regaining a sense of safety may take days to weeks or even months to years, depending on the severity of the trauma and if it was chronic or a one-time instance. There's a lot that goes into it. And to begin recovery, you have to figure out what areas of your life need to be stabilized and how that will be accomplished. A person who has experienced trauma may struggle regulating or soothing difficult emotions that they may not consciously associate with their trauma, such as anger bursts, depression, feelings of helplessness. Given Persephone's symptoms of trauma even prior to her assault, namely chronic nightmares that are very specific with recurring themes of being trapped, she may be struggling to really identify what's off balance because her normal, even before this moment, was not a balanced pH, so to speak. In order to gain safety and stability, we have to learn how to regulate and manage these difficult and overwhelming emotions by practicing mindfulness regularly. Mindfulness being the psychological process of purposefully bringing one's attention to experiences occurring in the present moment without judgment. Staying present when you feel yourself sliding back into those traumatic moments or disassociating. I'm very tactile based, so for me, touching soothing textures like fabric or grass is very helpful. Or taking a moment to concentrate on the way my feet meet the ground and my weight settles and distributes. Hyper awareness of my surroundings and the way my senses take them in. Phase 2 has to do with remembrance and mourning. This is shifting to processing the trauma, putting words and emotions to it, making meaning out of it. This process usually is and should be undertaken with a counselor or a therapist of some kind, just so you're not getting stuck in your own head, and your friends, while they are lovely, are not therapists. We'll talk again about that when we talk about consent and emotional consent. It might not be necessary to spend a lot of time in this phase, depending. It is, however, necessary to be continuing to attend to safety and stability during this phase. Continuing to attend to safety allows the persona affected by the trauma to move through this phase in a way that integrates the story of the trauma rather than reacts to it in a fight, flight, or freeze response. Essentially, it's making it so you integrate that traumatic experience into the rest of your life rather than where your brain has locked it away, where you only remember it through horrifying triggers. Pacing and timing are crucial during this phase. If you're overwhelmed and emotionally flooded when talking about your traumatic memories, safety and stability must be regained before you move further with your story. The point is not to relive your trauma, but it's also not to retell the story with no emotion attached to it. This involves the really important step of exploring and mourning the losses associated with that trauma and providing a space to grieve and express those emotions. Just to be clear here, we're not at this phase yet. Allowing Eros to see what happened is a step in the right direction, but it's not quite talking about it. But this does mean she will have someone, possibly the best someone in the Pantheon, considering his knowledge of understanding of both love and consent and all of that, who can encourage her to take those healing steps. Plus, hey, now she has a witness when she decides to make things public for that extra support, and it will also help her if she tries to talk herself out of it wasn't that bad, which she was already doing prior. So, Phase 3 is reconnection and integration. With this, there needs to be a creation of a new sense of self and a new future. This last step involves redefining yourself in the context of meaningful relationships. Through this process, that trauma is no longer a defining principle of your life. The trauma becomes integrated into your life story, but it's not the only story that makes you you. In this stage of recovery, you recognize the impact this victimization had on you, but you're ready to take steps towards empowerment and self-determined living. In some cases, people who've experienced trauma find a mission through which not only they can continue to heal and grow, but they can help others do the same, like volunteering with youth or peer mentoring, or making mental health a central pillar of your YouTube channel. Successful resolution of the effects of trauma is a powerful testament to the resiliency of the human spirit. Look at me. I'm a marshmallow. I'm sassy, but I'm a marshmallow. Or, as my friends Aubrey and Laser would put it, I'm a sensitive badass.
And still a badass.
Recovery is an individual process, and it will look different for everyone. There is an intense desire to get better quickly, and often people feel like the process is taking too long or they must not be doing it right. It's okay. You are. I promise. Recovery is not defined by a complete absence of thoughts or feelings about your traumatic experience, but finding a way to live where it isn't in complete control of your life. Recovery is not defined by the complete absence of thoughts or feelings about your traumatic experiences. It's finding a way to live so that they're not in control of your life. It's important to be gentle and compassionate with yourself as you move through this healing process. And even after you've gone through all of these phases, you'll still find yourself practicing mindfulness. I do it regularly. Persephone has a long road of healing ahead of her, from more than just her assault, by the looks of it. But I do believe she will be all right in the end. And you know what? You will too. I love you all so much, and I hope you practice vigilant empathy, not just for your peers, but for yourself. Go do something kind for you. Have a cup of tea, hug a fluffy creature, ask your parent, partner, friend, whoever, if you can have a cuddle and watch a feel-good movie. Do something lovely for you. I have contracted some sort of plague. I'm gonna take this off if I can. In case you need a good laugh. This was a terrible idea to do this. I should have hunted for all the pins first. In contracting said plague, it's put a delay in my plans, which included trying to get more than one video out a week, or get a backlog so I can do that, so that when we have heavier topics like this one, I'm just gonna be stuck. There we go. Hey, she's free. You'll have something to look at, hopefully, and be like, that was rough. I have a lovely back catalog if you want to look at it that's not as depressing as this one. In the meantime, if you would like to share this video and give it a thumbs up, I'd be very grateful. If you haven't hit that little notification bell, it lets you know when I post things. She's free. Until next time, kindred, please keep on the windy side of care, and most importantly, stay curious.
I let things bother me that I shouldn't let bother me, and I feel sorry like I should be stronger. I know I shouldn't listen to the insults or the heckles, but I listen and they all stick with me longer.